There is a verse that millions of people have read. Millions of people have memorized it, quoted it, underlined it in worn Bibles, and whispered it in moments of quiet desperation. It sits in Psalm 73, near the very end of a chapter that begins in confusion and ends in something that can only be described as a kind of coming home. The verse is simple. It is not complicated by long theological words or difficult ancient grammar. Anyone can read it in less than 10 seconds. But as for me, it is good to be near God. And yet, here is the question that almost no one asks. Here is the question that most teachers skip over, most sermons never reach, and most devotional readings glide past without pausing. If this verse is so simple, if it is so widely known, if it has been read by so many sincere and searching hearts across so many centuries, then why do so many of those same sincere and searching hearts still feel far from God? Why does a person read "It is good to be near God" and feel in the very same moment that nearness is precisely what they do not have? This is not a small question. This is not a question about the right translation or the correct theological framing. This is a question about something that happens or fails to happen inside a human being when they read a truth and cannot find it in their own experience. Joel Goldsmith spent his life sitting with exactly this kind of question. Not the question of what a verse means in its historical context, not the question of what a scholar might say about the original Hebrew, but the question of what happens inside a person when they encounter a spiritual truth and feel the gap between the words and their own inner life. And what Goldsmith discovered through decades of contemplative practice and work with thousands of students was something that the religious world had largely missed, something hidden, not in obscure texts or ancient manuscripts, but hidden in plain sight, in the very assumptions that most people carry into their reading of verses like this one. The assumption is this, that nearness to God is something you have to travel toward, that it is a destination, that it exists somewhere along a path of prayer, discipline, devotion, and moral improvement. That if you are not feeling it right now, the reason is that you have not yet done enough to arrive there. This assumption feels completely natural. It feels humble. It feels appropriately religious. And it is, according to Goldsmith, the very assumption that keeps the experience of divine nearness perpetually out of reach. Because what if the distance was never real? What if near God is not a place you move toward, but a reality you have simply not yet recognized? What if the problem is not that you are far from God, but that you have been looking for closeness in the wrong direction entirely? This is what today's exploration is about. Not a lecture, not a sermon, not a list of things to do better. This is an invitation to sit with one of the most quietly revolutionary verses in all of Scripture and to hear what it is actually saying, not with the ears of religious habit, but with the ears of a consciousness that is finally ready to stop traveling and simply arrive. By the end of this journey, Psalm 73:28 will no longer read the same way it did before. Not because the words will have changed, but because something inside you will have. To understand what Psalm 73:28 is really saying, you have to understand the man who wrote it. And to understand the man who wrote it, you cannot begin at the end. You have to begin where he began, which is not in peace, not in devotion, not in the clarity of settled faith. You have to begin in the middle of a crisis that most religious people are never honest enough to admit they are also living through. The man's name was Asaph. He was not an ordinary member of the congregation. He was a worship leader, a musician, a man appointed to stand before the community and lead them into the presence of God. His entire life was organized around sacred things. His entire identity was built on the assumption that the life of faith leads somewhere good, that devotion produces stability, that the person who walks closely with God will find their path lit and their needs met. And then something happened that religious identities are not built to survive. He looked around. He looked at the people who gave no thought to God, who lived only for their own pleasure and their own advancement, who had no interior life of prayer or devotion, no sense of accountability to anything beyond their own appetites. And what he saw destroyed something in him. What he saw was that they were prospering. Their lives were comfortable, their bodies were healthy, their finances were stable, their futures looked bright. The things that Asaph had been told would come to those who trusted God seemed to have landed without any effort at all in the laps of people who had never once sought God. This is the crisis that opens Psalm 73, and it is important to understand exactly what kind of crisis it is. It is not simply the crisis of a man who is envious of other people's success. The emotional content is much more specific than envy. What Asaph is experiencing is the collapse of a framework. He has organized his entire interior life around a certain understanding of how the world works, of how divine faithfulness expresses itself in human experience, of what the reward of devotion looks like. And the evidence before his eyes is contradicting that framework completely. This is what makes his crisis so recognizable to anyone who has lived long enough inside a life of sincere faith. It is not the crisis of doubt about whether God exists. It is the far more unsettling crisis of doubt about whether the God you have been relating to actually relates back in the way you were told. Asaph writes in the opening of the psalm that his feet had almost slipped. He almost lost his footing entirely. The word he uses suggests not a gentle stumble, but the kind of catastrophic loss of balance that ends in a fall. He was, in the most honest language available to him, on the edge of abandoning the whole structure of his faith. And here is what is important about this. Asaph was not a casual believer who had been giving faith a half-hearted try. He was not someone who had merely performed the outer motions of religion without any genuine interior investment. He was a man whose whole life was saturated in devotion, the leader of worship, the keeper of sacred music, the one who stood before the community and pointed toward God. If the framework of faith was going to collapse for someone, it was supposed to collapse for the people on the edges, the lukewarm, the uncommitted. It was not supposed to collapse for Asaph, and yet there he was, feet almost slipping, heart full of questions that his theology had not prepared him to ask. This is where the psalm begins, not with an answer, not with a reassuring theological resolution, with a man who is honest enough to say that the ground he thought he was standing on had turned out to be far less stable than he believed. What Asaph does next is something that contemplative teachers across traditions have recognized as one of the most spiritually significant moves a human being can make. He does not pretend. He does not perform. He does not reach for a reassuring phrase that will cover over the discomfort. He lets the crisis be exactly what it is. He describes his bitterness. He describes his sense of pointlessness. He describes the feeling that he had been keeping his heart pure and washing his hands in innocence, the ancient language of moral and ritual purity, and that it had gotten him nowhere. He writes with the kind of raw honesty that most religious communities do not actually make space for. The honesty that admits the devotional life has not delivered what it promised. This raw honesty is not, as many would fear, the sign of a faith that is failing. According to Goldsmith, it is actually the sign of a consciousness that is beginning to do something very important. It is the sign of a consciousness that is becoming too real for its own illusions, because here is what the crisis of Asaph's faith is actually revealing. Not that God is absent, not that devotion is meaningless, but that the framework Asaph was using to understand God, to measure God's faithfulness, to calculate whether he was near or far from the divine, that framework was built on something far too small. He had been measuring nearness to God by the condition of his circumstances. He had been reading the quality of his relationship with God off the surface of his material life. And when the material life did not reflect the promise, he concluded that something had gone wrong in the relationship. This is the mistake that makes Psalm 73 so universally resonant. Not because everyone faces the same circumstances Asaph faced, but because nearly everyone has, at some point, made the same interpretive error. The error of reading the presence or absence of God off the surface of what is happening in their lives. And this is precisely where the journey of Psalm 73 begins to reveal something that goes far beyond the specific historical circumstances of its author. It begins to reveal something about the nature of consciousness itself, about the difference between looking at life and looking from the ground of something that is deeper than any circumstance. Asaph has almost slipped. His feet are at the edge, but the story is not over. In fact, the most important part of the story is just beginning. Before we follow Asaph further into the psalm, we need to pause and look honestly at something that most of us carry into every verse we read, every prayer we pray, and every moment we seek to enter. We need to look at what we were taught near God means, because the misunderstanding did not begin with us. It was handed to us. It was handed to us in Sunday school when we were told that good behavior brings you closer to God and bad behavior pushes you away. It was handed to us in sermons that described prayer as the primary instrument of drawing near, as if God were a frequency you could only receive if your transmitter was working properly. It was handed to us in the structure of religious practice itself, which organizes devotional life around activities designed to close the gap between the human and the divine. Pray more, and you will be nearer. Read your Bible more, and you will be nearer. Attend church more faithfully, and you will be nearer. Sin less, and you will be nearer. Give more, and you will be nearer. None of these things are wrong in themselves. Prayer is not a bad thing. Scripture reading is not a bad thing. Community worship is not a bad thing. Moral seriousness is not a bad thing. The problem is not the activities. The problem is what they were implicitly teaching us about the nature of divine nearness. They were teaching us that nearness is a product, that it is something you produce through sufficient religious effort, that the gap between you and God is real, measurable, and closable through the right combination of spiritual disciplines, that God is, in some fundamental sense, at a distance from which he can be approached, and that the approaching is accomplished through what you do. This is the assumption buried inside most religious instruction, so deep that it is never explicitly stated, never examined, never questioned. It is the water in which religious life swims, invisible because it is everywhere. And Joel Goldsmith looked at this assumption and saw it clearly for what it was, not humility, not faithfulness. A misunderstanding about the nature of God so fundamental that it shaped everything built upon it. Fan 2B Goldsmith did not arrive at this insight easily or quickly. He was not a man who had never tried the conventional approach. He had prayed, he had studied, he had pursued spiritual life with the seriousness of someone who genuinely believed it mattered more than anything else. And he had experienced, as most sincere seekers eventually do, the frustration of doing everything right and still feeling that the deepest thing he was seeking remained somehow just out of reach. And then something shifted, not through a new technique, not through more effort, through a recognition. The recognition was this: the gap was in the map, not in the territory. The distance between the human and the divine was not a feature of reality. It was a feature of the framework through which reality was being interpreted. And no amount of effort applied within that framework would dissolve it, because the framework itself was what was generating the sense of distance in the first place. To understand this fully, consider what the conventional religious map looks like. On one side, there is the human being, fallen, limited, mortal, inherently separate from the divine. On the other side, there is God, infinite, holy, perfect, inhabiting a realm utterly different from the human realm. Between them, a gap, and the religious life is the project of crossing that gap through the right combination of belief, behavior, and practice. Within this map, near God, is a position you move toward. It is something you can be more or less of. You can be close to God, or you can be far from God, and the distance is determined by how diligently you are pursuing the crossing of the gap. Now consider what happens when a sincere person operates within this map for years, even decades, doing everything the map tells them to do, and still cannot shake the feeling that the nearness they are seeking remains perpetually at a slight remove. The map says, try harder, pray more, be better. But at some point, the honest soul begins to wonder whether the problem might not be the effort, but the map itself. This was the woman who had attended the same church for 25 years. She knew the liturgy by heart. She could recite passages of scripture fluently in context with the accompanying theological explanations. She served on committees. She visited the sick. She gave generously. By every external measure, her religious life was exemplary. And yet, in the small hours of one particular night, lying awake in the dark, she found herself confronting a question she had never dared to ask directly. She had spent 25 years learning everything about God. She could describe his attributes, his actions in history, his promises to his people. But could she describe what it felt like to know him, not about him, but to actually know him, the way you know a presence that is in the room with you? She could not. And in that moment of honest recognition, something cracked open. Not her faith. What cracked open was her confidence in the map she had been using. For the first time, she allowed herself to wonder whether all those years of right religious activity had been teaching her to move in one direction, while the thing she was actually looking for had been in a completely different direction all along, not further out, further in. There is a conversation that happens inside a great many religious people that almost never happens outside them. It is a conversation that takes place in the space between what they profess and what they actually experience. And it is one of the most spiritually significant conversations a person can have, precisely because it is so rarely spoken aloud. It goes something like this. I'm doing everything I was told to do. I am praying, I am reading, I am attending, I am serving. I'm trying to be the kind of person whose life reflects genuine faith. And I believe, or at least I want to believe, that God is real and present and near. But if I am honest, completely honest, with no one listening except myself, what I actually feel most of the time is something more like absence than presence. More like the echo of a room that was once occupied than the warmth of a room where someone is actually there. This feeling is one of the most common experiences in the interior life of sincere believers, and it is one of the least discussed. The reasons for the silence are not difficult to understand. In most religious communities, admitting that your devotional life feels empty is experienced as an admission of spiritual failure. It invites a certain kind of response, gentle or otherwise, that suggests the problem is insufficient effort, insufficient faith, insufficient seriousness about the life of prayer. The implicit message is, if you were really seeking, you would find. If you are not finding, you are not really seeking. This response, however well-intentioned, simply deepens the wound, because the person sitting with the quiet emptiness is often the most serious seeker in the room. They are not empty because they have not been trying. They are empty precisely because they have been trying so hard for so long, and the trying has not produced the thing they were trying to produce. Joel Goldsmith had a phrase for this. He called it the hunger that religion cannot feed. Not hunger that religion does not try to feed. Religion tries very hard. It offers structures and practices and communities and traditions and an enormous accumulated wisdom about the life of faith. But there is a particular kind of hunger, which Goldsmith believed was the most essential hunger of the human soul, that cannot be satisfied by any of those offerings, because it is not hunger for information about God. It is not hunger for community with other seekers. It is not even hunger for moral transformation, though that may accompany it. It is hunger for the direct recognition of divine presence, the immediate, unmediated first-person experience of the reality that all the religious structures are pointing toward. And this hunger cannot be satisfied by more pointing. It can only be satisfied by arriving. The young pastor had been preparing his sermon for 3 days. The topic was the presence of God. He had gathered his texts carefully, selected his illustrations, crafted his argument, rehearsed his transitions. He was, by any reasonable measure, good at his job. His congregation respected him. His sermons were well organized, scripturally grounded, practically applicable. And then, on the evening before he was to preach, something strange happened. He was reading back through his notes, checking for anything he might have missed, and he stopped at a sentence he had written without thinking much about it. The sentence described what it felt like to be in the presence of God, the sense of being held, known, accompanied by something infinitely larger than yourself. He had written it as a description, as an illustration, as the kind of language that helps a congregation understand an abstract concept. And sitting there with that sentence in front of him, he realized he had written it from memory, not from experience. He was describing a country he had read about extensively but never visited. He was telling his congregation about a presence that he himself had not actually felt. He sat with this recognition for a long time. He did not throw away his sermon. He preached it on Sunday morning, and it went well. The congregation responded. Some people came to him afterward and said it had touched them. But the private conversation that had begun in him on Saturday evening was not finished. It had, in fact, barely started. Because for the first time, the gap between what he proclaimed and what he experienced had become visible to him as a gap rather than a matter of degree, and he could not unsee it. The seminary student in his final year had spent 4 years studying theology with genuine enthusiasm. He had engaged deeply with the history of Christian thought, with the doctrines of the faith, with the hermeneutical questions involved in reading ancient texts. He was, in the assessment of his professors, among the most capable students they had taught. And in his final semester, while writing a thesis on the experiential dimension of faith, he encountered a question he could not answer academically. He had been arguing that genuine faith involves not merely intellectual assent, but experiential encounter with the divine. He believed this. He had written persuasively about it. But sitting alone in his room one night, he had to ask himself whether he was describing something he actually knew, or something he was describing by extrapolation from what others had reported. He had read extensively about mystical experience. He had studied the accounts of contemplatives across centuries and traditions. But had he himself ever experienced the stillness in which something other than his own thinking was present? He did not know. And the not knowing was more honest, he realized, than anything he had written in 4 years. What is important to understand about this quiet emptiness, this hunger that religion cannot feed, is that it is not a failure, it is a beginning. Goldsmith was emphatic about this. The person who has performed the religious life faithfully and found it insufficient for the deepest need of their soul is not someone who has gone wrong. They are someone who has gone far enough along one path to discover that a different path is needed. Not a path away from God, a path toward God in a different direction. Inward rather than outward, downward rather than upward. The emptiness is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of a consciousness that has been honest enough to stop pretending that activity is the same as arrival. There is a threshold that every sincere seeker eventually reaches. It is the threshold at which the accumulated effort of the religious life produces not more of what it was producing, but a kind of exhaustion of that approach. Not despair exactly, but a recognition that the method being applied is not the right method for the destination being sought. Goldsmith called this threshold the turning point, not the low point of faith, the beginning of genuine spiritual awakening, the moment when the soul stops asking, "What more can I do?" and begins to ask for the first time a very different question. What if nearness is not something I do? What if it is something I recognize? Now we return to Asaph, because his journey does not end at the edge. His feet were almost slipping, but they did not slip. And what prevented the fall is one of the most quietly profound moments in all of Hebrew poetry. He entered the sanctuary. The 17th verse of Psalm 73 reads, "Until I entered the sanctuary of God, then I understood their final destiny." Most readings of this verse focus on what Asaph understood once he was inside the sanctuary. The resolution of his envy, the recognition that the prosperity of the wicked was not the final word on their story, the restoration of his confidence in the justice of divine ordering. These are real and important parts of what the verse is saying. But for the purpose of this exploration, the more significant word is the first word, until. Everything before the sanctuary was one kind of consciousness. Everything after was another. The sanctuary was not simply the location where a new thought occurred to him. It was the threshold of a shift in the quality of his awareness itself. And that shift is what made the understanding possible. This is not primarily a statement about architecture. The sanctuary here is not essentially a building. It is an interior space. It is the space that opens inside a human being when the ordinary noise of anxious thinking grows still enough for something else to be heard. Asaph had been carrying his crisis through his outer life, turning it over, examining it, becoming bitter, becoming exhausted. He had been trying to resolve it in the domain where it had arisen, the domain of comparison and circumstance and measurable outcomes. And in that domain it could not be resolved. Something led him into a different space. Something led him inward. And in that inward space, the inversion happened. Not a logical inversion, not an argument that changed his conclusion, but a perceptual inversion. The world looked different from inside the sanctuary, not because new facts had been introduced, but because the vantage point from which he was seeing had changed. There was a man in the middle of one of the most difficult years of his life. His marriage was struggling in ways that neither he nor his wife quite knew how to address. They had tried counseling, they had had the conversations, they had made the lists of things to work on, and they were both sincere, both genuinely wanting the relationship to find its way back to what it had once been. He came to speak with the priest not because he expected a solution. He had passed the stage where he believed a solution could be handed to him by someone else. He came because he did not know where else to go, and he needed to go somewhere. The priest was a quiet man, not particularly eloquent, not given to long theological explanations. He listened for a while, and then he did something unexpected. He did not offer advice. He did not cite scripture. He said simply, "Would you like to sit for a while in the chapel?" The man said yes. He sat alone in the chapel for perhaps 45 minutes. There was nothing particularly dramatic about the experience. The chapel was small and unremarkable. There were a few candles. There was silence. Somewhere in the middle of that silence, something happened that he was never able to describe adequately to anyone he tried to tell afterward. It was not a vision. It was not a voice. It was not an emotional release, though his eyes did fill once. It was more like a change in the quality of the air around him, or rather, a change in the quality of his own interior atmosphere. The weight that had been sitting in his chest for months lifted. Not completely, not permanently, but enough for him to feel, briefly and undeniably, that he was not as alone as he had believed himself to be. He did not receive an answer about his marriage, but he received something more fundamental than an answer. He received a recognition that there was something present in that silence that was not generated by his own thinking, something that had been there, he suddenly understood before he arrived, something that would be there after he left. He described it later as arriving home to a house that had always been inhabited. He had not known until that moment that the door had been unlocked all along. This is what the sanctuary means in Psalm 73. Not the building, the interior opening, the moment when a human consciousness, exhausted by its outer seeking, turns in a different direction and encounters what has always been present. What Asaph found in the sanctuary was not new information about God. It was the recognition of a presence that his crisis had never actually displaced. We have now arrived at the philosophical and contemplative center of this entire exploration. Everything before this point has been preparation. Every story of emptiness, every honest admission of the gap between religious activity and genuine interior encounter, every crisis like Asaph's has been pointing toward this. The word near, in it is good to be near God, is not a spatial word. This sounds simple. It sounds like it might be a minor semantic point, the kind of thing that matters to linguists, but not to people trying to actually live a spiritual life. But it is, in fact, the hinge on which everything turns. When we use the word near in ordinary language, we mean something about physical proximity. Near means at a small distance from. It means not yet arrived, but close. It implies a direction of travel, an approach, a closing of space between two separate objects. When this spatial meaning is unconsciously imported into the phrase near God, a whole architecture of assumptions comes with it. If near means approaching, then there is a distance to be closed. If there is a distance to be closed, then you are currently not at the destination. If you are not at the destination, your religious life is the project of getting there. And if the getting there is not yet complete, then by definition, you are not fully near. This architecture is so natural, so assumed, so deeply embedded in the way we have learned to think about spiritual life, that most people never notice they have imported it at all. It feels like a description of reality. But it is, according to Goldsmith, a profound mistake about the nature of both God and consciousness. Because here is what Goldsmith saw, and what the contemplative tradition in its deepest expressions has always known. God is not an object that exists at a particular location. Consciousness is not an object that exists at a particular location. The relationship between divine presence and human awareness is not a spatial relationship at all. It is more like the relationship between the light and the eye that sees by it. You cannot say that the eye is near the light when the light is the very condition that makes the eye's seeing possible. Joel Goldsmith's central teaching, the insight that ran through everything he wrote and taught across decades, was this: the divine is not something you approach. It is the ground of your own consciousness. It is not over there waiting to be reached. It is what you are looking from. This does not mean that God and the individual human being are identical. Goldsmith was careful about this. It does not mean that there is no distinction between the infinite and the finite, between the divine and the human, but it means that the relationship between them is not the relationship of two separate objects in space, one near and one far, one here and one there. It is more like the relationship between the ocean and a wave. The wave is a distinct form. It has its own shape, its own movement, its own particular character. But it is not made of something different from the ocean. It is not separate from the ocean in the sense that a boat on the water is separate from the ocean. It arises from the ocean, is sustained by the ocean, and returns to the ocean. The ocean is not near the wave. The ocean is what the wave is. This analogy, like all analogies for the divine, is imperfect, but it points towards something that the spatial model of nearness completely misses. It points toward an intimacy that is not produced by closing a gap, but recognized by understanding that there was never a gap to close. The woman had been on every pilgrimage she could afford. She had walked the Camino de Santiago. She had visited the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. She had spent time in Rome, in Assisi, in the monasteries of the Eastern Orthodox tradition. She had traveled to ashrams in India and sat in meditation centers in Southeast Asia. She was a genuine seeker. There was nothing performative about her traveling. She was looking for something real. And after years of searching, she came to a conclusion that she arrived at slowly, reluctantly, and with some embarrassment, given how much she had invested in the searching. The thing she was looking for was not in any of those places, not because those places were not real or not sacred, but because the thing she was looking for was not a geographic destination. It was a quality of interior attention. And interior attention could not be obtained at a particular location. It could only be cultivated where you actually were. She described coming home from her last pilgrimage and sitting in her ordinary kitchen, in her ordinary house, in her ordinary morning light, and feeling, for the first time, something she had not felt in Jerusalem or Rome or India, a quality of stillness that was not produced by the atmosphere of a sacred site, but that arose from within her when she finally stopped looking anywhere. She sat still, and something that had apparently been waiting for her to stop moving recognized itself. The man in his late 60s had prayed every morning for 40 years. He had never missed a morning. He was not someone who went through the motions. He meant it. Every morning he knelt or sat and turned his attention toward God and asked for what he needed and gave thanks for what he had and listened for whatever might come. And for 40 years, it had been a good practice. It had shaped his character. It had given him a sense of orientation. It had connected him to something larger than his daily concerns. But there was always, underneath the practice, a very subtle thing, almost too subtle to name, a sense that the prayer was a reaching, that there was a distance being crossed each morning, a gap being addressed, and that the addressing of the gap was the point of the practice, that without the reaching, the distance would simply remain. One morning, for no reason he could identify afterward, he did not reach. He sat down in his usual chair, in his usual posture, at his usual time, and instead of beginning the reaching, he simply sat, without direction, without agenda, without the familiar movement toward. And in that moment of not reaching, something became apparent that had apparently been present every morning for 40 years without ever quite breaking through the noise of the reaching itself. He could not describe it precisely. He said later that it was as if he had been knocking on a door every morning for 40 years. And on this particular morning, instead of knocking, he had simply leaned against the door and discovered that it had no lock, and that it was not closed, and that it had perhaps never been closed. I had been praying to God for 40 years, he said. That morning, I realized I had never stopped to ask whether God was already present. The question is not whether you are near God. The question Goldsmith would ask, the question that changes everything, is this: have you ever been far? If the experience of divine nearness is already the ground of our existence, if consciousness and divine presence are not separated by a gap that religious effort must close, then where does the experience of distance come from? Why is it so persistent? Why does it feel so utterly real? These are not naive questions. They deserve a serious answer. Because the sense of distance from God is not merely an intellectual mistake that can be corrected by the right argument. It is an experienced reality for millions of sincere people. The emptiness is felt. The absence is felt. The silence of God, in the painful sense of the word, is felt. And any account of divine nearness that simply tells people they are imagining the distance is not honest about what human consciousness actually experiences. Goldsmith did not dismiss the experience of distance. He took it seriously, but he understood its origin very differently from the way religious frameworks typically understand it. Most religious frameworks, when confronted with the experience of divine distance, have two explanations. Either the person is responsible, they have sinned, they have been unfaithful, they have not been trying hard enough, or the distance is divinely intended, a kind of spiritual testing designed to produce growth through deprivation. Both of these explanations locate the problem in something that can, in principle, be addressed. Confess the sin, try harder, pass the test. Goldsmith's account is different, and it goes much deeper. The experience of distance, in his understanding, is generated not by moral failure or divine withdrawal, but by a particular quality of attention. Specifically, it is generated by the attention that is perpetually oriented toward the outer surface of experience and looking for God there. When you look for God in circumstances, in the way events unfold, in the presence or absence of answers to prayer, in the emotional texture of devotional experience, you are looking for something infinite in something finite. You are looking for something that by its nature cannot be contained in any form, in the very forms through which experience is delivered. And because the infinite cannot be found by searching the finite, the search comes up empty. And the empty search feels like absence. The distance is not a feature of reality, it is a feature of looking in the wrong direction. The way this happens is not random. It is a direct consequence of the language and imagery through which most people learn to think about God. Consider the language of approach, to draw near to God, to seek His face, to reach out to Him, to come before Him. These are the phrases that fill liturgical language, devotional literature, and the everyday vocabulary of religious life. They are ancient phrases, resonant phrases, phrases that have shaped the interior life of faith across many centuries and many traditions. But consider what they imply. To draw near implies that you are currently not near. To seek His face implies that His face is currently not visible. To reach out implies that what you are reaching for is currently not in contact with you. To come before Him implies that you are currently not in His presence. Every one of these phrases, regardless of the intention behind it, takes as its starting point a picture of separation. God is over there. You are here. The religious life is the movement from here to there. This picture becomes the invisible template through which all subsequent religious experience is interpreted. When you feel something in prayer, you interpret it as having gotten a little closer. When you feel nothing, you interpret it as having remained distant or moved further away. The emotional texture of your interior life becomes a map of your distance from God, and the map is self-reinforcing because whatever you experience, you interpret it through the framework of the gap. Goldsmith spent years observing what happened in students when this framework was gently but persistently examined. Not attacked, not dismissed, simply examined, asked to show its credentials, asked whether it was actually a description of reality or a description of a particular way of organizing experience that had been absorbed without examination. And what he observed was that when the framework began to loosen, the sense of distance began to loosen with it. Not all at once, not without resistance, but gradually, as the assumption of separation became less automatic, the direct recognition of presence became less occasional. The theologian had devoted his career to the systematic study of Christian doctrine. He had published extensively on the attributes of God, on the relationship between divine transcendence and divine immanence, on the nature of revelation and the conditions of religious knowledge. He was by any measure a deeply learned man, And in his late career, he wrote something in a private journal that he never published and that his colleagues would not have recognized as coming from the same intellectual tradition. He wrote, "I have spent 40 years describing the conditions under which God can be known. I wonder now whether I have spent 40 years describing obstacles, not to knowing God, but to recognizing that God is already known." He never pursued this thought in his academic work. It was perhaps too disruptive to the framework within which his life's work was organized. But the thought itself was there, and it was honest, and it was pointing towards something that his systematic theology had never been able to accommodate. The framework that generates the sense of distance is not the truth about reality. It is a habit of attention, and habits of attention can change. We have now cleared enough ground to approach the central distinction that Goldsmith's teaching rests on. It is a distinction that sounds simple when stated directly, but whose implications run through every dimension of the spiritual life. The distinction is this: being near God is not something you do. It is something you recognize. To understand why this distinction matters, we need to look carefully at three things that are often confused with each other. These three things are religious activity, spiritual feeling, and divine awareness. They are not the same thing. They can coexist. They can also be entirely separate from each other, and confusing them is one of the primary sources of the persistent emptiness that many sincere seekers experience. Religious activity is what you do. It is the practices, the disciplines, the observances, the structures that organize the exterior life of faith. Prayer is a religious activity. Reading scripture is a religious activity. Attending worship is a religious activity. Service and charitable giving are religious activities. None of these are bad things. Goldsmith did not dismiss them, but he was clear that they are activities, which means their value lies in what they point toward, not in the activities themselves. Spiritual feeling is what you feel. It is the emotional texture of the interior life, the warmth in worship, the tears in prayer, the sense of uplift in a beautiful liturgy, the comfort of familiar ritual, the sudden sense of being accompanied in a moment of crisis. These feelings are real. They are experiences that many people treasure and that sustain them through difficult times. But they are feelings, which means they are transient. They depend on conditions, and they vary enormously from person to person and from moment to moment in the same person. Divine awareness is neither of these things. Divine awareness, in Goldsmith's understanding, is the recognition of something that does not come and go with feelings or activities. It is not produced by performing the right practices. It is not indicated by the presence of particular emotions. It is a quality of consciousness that becomes available when the other layers of experience grow quiet enough for something underneath them to be noticed. Goldsmith described it using language that was careful not to make it sound like another achievement. He did not say, divine awareness is something you attain. He said it is something you uncover. It was there before you began uncovering it. The uncovering is not a production. It is a recognition. This is why the practice of contemplative prayer, in the deepest sense of the tradition, is not about producing something in the practitioner. It is not about generating a feeling or achieving a state. It is about removing enough of the noise of ordinary mental activity that what is already present can be perceived. The man had grown up in a tradition where the quality of your faith was measured by the intensity of your religious feeling. Sunday worship was designed to produce emotional states, and the emotional states were taken as evidence of genuine encounter with God. Cry in worship, and you had met with God. Leave dry-eyed, and something was lacking in you. He had spent years chasing the feeling. He had been to revival meetings. He had sought out the most emotionally intense worship environments he could find. He had, at various points, genuinely experienced what the tradition called being moved by the Spirit, tears and warmth and a sense of being swept up in something larger. And he had noticed with increasing frustration that these experiences never lasted, that the day after the revival meeting, the feeling was gone, that the emotional intensity of Sunday morning had dissipated by Sunday afternoon, that the pattern of his spiritual life was a series of emotional peaks separated by flat valleys, and that the valleys were getting longer. He began to suspect that what he was chasing was not what he thought it was, not because the feelings were fake. He believed they were real, but because feelings, however genuine, are not stable. They are weather, not climate. They come and go. They depend on external conditions. And if your experience of divine nearness is entirely indexed to the presence of particular feelings, then your experience of divine nearness is entirely at the mercy of circumstances. He stopped attending the high-intensity worship services. He found a small, quiet community that practiced contemplative prayer in silence. He hated it at first. There was nothing to feel. There was no music, no emotional stimulation, no moment of being swept up, just silence, just sitting, just the slow, uncomfortable process of learning to be present without producing anything. It took months before anything shifted. And when it did shift, it was nothing like what he had been trained to look for. It was not a feeling. It was more like a recognition, a quiet, stable, completely undramatic recognition that something was present in the silence that was not his own thinking, something that had apparently always been there, something that did not require his emotional participation in order to persist. He described it as discovering that the floor existed, that underneath all the jumping and dancing and emotional movement there had always been solid ground, and that the solid ground was more reliable than any of the movement that had been happening on top of it. The woman who described the moment of unexpected recognition during an ordinary household task had not been seeking anything when it happened. She'd been standing at the kitchen sink, washing the dishes from dinner, her mind occupied with the minor logistics of the evening. There was nothing spiritually prepared about the moment. She had not been praying. She had not been reading anything uplifting. She had simply been present in a very ordinary way to a very ordinary activity. And something occurred that she could only describe as a sudden clarity. Not a vision, not an emotion, not even a thought exactly. More like a quality of attention that briefly became transparent to something it was normally opaque to. She said later that the best way she could describe it was that for a moment she became aware of awareness itself. Not of any particular content of her experience, not of the dishes or the water or the evening light in the kitchen, but of the fact that there was awareness, and that awareness itself seemed to be made of something, or inhabited by something, or to be an expression of something that was immeasurably peaceful and complete. And then the ordinary moment reasserted itself, and she was just washing dishes again. But she had been shown something she had been going to church for 20 years without encountering in 20 years of going to church. Something that did not require church to be present, because it was not located in a church. It was located in the ground of awareness itself. Divine awareness is not a religious achievement. It is a recognition of what is already the case. And Goldsmith's deepest teaching is that the gap between the current quality of your consciousness and this recognition is not a gap of moral progress or doctrinal correctness or devotional intensity. It's simply a gap of attention, a gap that closes, not by effort applied in the right direction, but by effort released in all directions. If divine awareness is not produced by religious activity or generated by spiritual feeling, if it is something recognized rather than achieved, then the natural question is this: what conditions make the recognition possible? The answer that the contemplative tradition gives, the answer that Goldsmith gave, the answer that the deepest strands of Christian mysticism give is a single word: stillness. not as a technique, not as a discipline to be mastered, not as a state to be produced by the right combination of breathing practices and mental focusing strategies, but as the natural condition of a consciousness that has, even temporarily, ceased its perpetual movement. To understand what this means, it helps to understand what the normal condition of human consciousness is. The normal condition is movement, ceaseless movement, from one thought to the next, from one concern to the next, from one planning sequence to the next, from one reaction to the next. The mind in its ordinary state is not still. It is, in fact, almost never still. Even in sleep, it continues its activity in dreams. This movement is not pathological, it is functional. It serves the purposes of navigating daily life, of solving problems, of maintaining social relationships, of organizing experience into a coherent and usable form. Without this movement, the practical life could not be conducted. But there is a cost, and the cost is that a consciousness in perpetual movement cannot easily notice what is constant. What is constant appears, from the perspective of constant movement, as either absence or background, both of which amount to the same thing. A radio constantly playing static cannot hear the signal that is present beneath the static. Divine presence, in Goldsmith's understanding, is not louder than the noise of the mind. It does not compete with ordinary mental activity. It does not interrupt the stream of thought to announce itself. It is, in the language of Elijah's vision, a still, small voice, a presence that is available in the quiet beneath the noise, not in competition with the noise. This is why stillness is not a technique for getting something. It is the condition in which something already present becomes perceptible. There are 4 layers of stillness that Goldsmith described in his teaching, moving from the most accessible to the most profound. The first layer is exterior silence, the absence of auditory noise. This is the most accessible form of stillness, and the most obviously incomplete. It is possible to be in complete exterior silence and to be utterly absent from stillness in every more important sense. The noisy mind in a quiet room is still a noisy mind. The second layer is the stillness of thinking, the temporary cessation of the analytical, planning, narrating activity of the mind. This is much harder to produce and much harder to sustain. Most people who attempt contemplative prayer or meditation encounter immediately how unwilling the mind is to be still at this level. Every attempt at quiet is met with a flood of thoughts. This is not failure. It is, in fact, the beginning of an important discovery, which is that you are not your thoughts, because if you were, you could not observe them with the slight sense of distance that is required to notice how numerous and relentless they are. The third layer is the stillness of emotion, the quieting not just of analytical thought, but of the underlying emotional tone that colors all experience. This is deeper and rarer. The emotions are like the weather of the interior life, and most people live so continuously inside their emotional weather that they are not aware of the sky above it. The stillness of emotion is not emotional numbness. It is more like the quality of clear sky that becomes visible when the clouds thin. Underneath the emotional movements, there is something that is not moved. The fourth layer is the stillness that Goldsmith sometimes called the stillness of consciousness itself. This is the most difficult to describe because it is the most fundamental. It is the recognition that awareness itself, prior to any content that arises within it, is inherently still. The movement happens in awareness. The thoughts, the emotions, the perceptions, all of these arise and pass in awareness. But awareness itself does not move. It is, in Goldsmith's language, the sanctuary, the place that is always already present, always already still, always already available. And it is in this deepest layer of stillness that divine presence is recognized, not because God is hiding in the depths of human consciousness, but because the depth of human consciousness and the ground of divine presence are, at their most fundamental level, not two separate things. The physician had not come to contemplative practice for spiritual reasons. He had come because he was exhausted. 20 years of emergency medicine had taken something from him that he could not identify precisely. A quality of presence, of being actually in his own life rather than simply moving through it. His therapist had suggested meditation. He had resisted for 2 years, finding the idea too intangible for his empirically trained mind. He finally agreed to try it simply because he had run out of other options. He began with 10 minutes a day, sitting quietly, trying to follow a simple instruction he had been given. Simply observe what arises in awareness without engaging with it. Let thoughts come, let them pass. Return to the simple fact of being present. The first weeks were, in his own description, humbling. His mind was far more chaotic than he had realized. The stream of thought was relentless. He could not maintain the observing stance for more than a few seconds before being pulled back into the content of one thought or another. But gradually, something shifted, not dramatically, not with any mystical fireworks, simply a slight increase in the ability to notice the space between thoughts, a slight increase in the quality of what he could only describe as background quiet. And then one morning, somewhere in the 3rd month of practice, the background quiet became foreground. Not for long, perhaps 30 seconds of actual time. But in those 30 seconds, the quality of his experience was entirely different from anything he could remember. There was no fear, there was no plan, there was no self in the usual anxious sense of the word. There was simply awareness, and the awareness was completely at rest. And the rest was not emptiness, but the most complete sense of okayness he had ever experienced. He was a man of science, and not given to religious language, but sitting afterward, trying to make sense of what had happened. The only word that kept returning to him was presence, not his presence, not the presence of his thoughts, or his professional identity, or his plans for the future. Simply presence, something present, something that was at home in the silence, in a way that his ordinary self-concept was not. He could not name it, but he recognized it, and the recognition was more certain than any intellectual conclusion he had ever reached. The mother had been sitting beside her young son's bed long after he had fallen asleep. She had come in to check on him and found herself unable to leave, not from worry, from something she could not name. The room was quiet in the particular way that rooms with sleeping children are quiet, a quality of peace that is almost tangible. She sat in the dim light and watched her child breathe, and found that her own mind had grown uncharacteristically still, simply from the absorption of being in that specific kind of quiet. And in that stillness, she became aware of something she had not expected. It was not a feeling in the ordinary sense. It was more like a quality of accompaniment, a sense that the room was held by something larger than the room. That the peace of that moment was not merely the absence of noise, but the presence of something that was using the quiet to make itself known. She was not a mystic. She was not a person given to describing her experiences in spiritual language. She would have been uncomfortable with that kind of language. But she said afterward to the friend she trusted enough to tell, "Sitting there in the dark with my son asleep, I understood for the first time what people mean when they say God is near. Not in a religious way, just near, just here, the same way the room was here." Stillness is not the absence of something. It is the presence of something that cannot be perceived through noise. We have arrived now at what Goldsmith called sacred intimacy. This phrase requires careful unpacking because the word intimacy carries connotations that can mislead. In ordinary usage, intimacy implies relationship between two distinct beings. Emotional closeness, deep knowledge of the other, vulnerability shared and received. This is a real and beautiful dimension of human experience. But when Goldsmith spoke of sacred intimacy, he was pointing towards something that is both more and other than this. Sacred intimacy, in his understanding, is not primarily a relational experience in the psychological sense. It is not about developing a deep emotional relationship with God the way one develops a deep emotional relationship with another person. It is something more fundamental. It is the recognition that the boundary between your consciousness and divine presence is not as solid as you have been living as though it were. This is the thing that the soul most deeply wants, and the thing that the structure of religion most consistently prevents it from finding. Because religion, as an institution, has a vested interest in maintaining the framework of distance. If God is immediately accessible in the ground of your own consciousness, without mediation, without institution, without the approved structures of religious approach, then the institution's role as intermediary becomes, at best, optional and, at worst, an obstacle. Goldsmith was not anti-religious in his conclusions. He found deep value in the contemplative traditions of Christianity and beyond, but he was honest about the way that the institution of religion can, unintentionally, train people out of the very recognition it is nominally dedicated to facilitating. Sacred intimacy cannot be mediated. That is its defining characteristic. It is the direct recognition of presence, not the belief in presence, not the emotional experience of presence, not the theological affirmation of presence, the direct recognition. And what prevents this recognition is almost never sinfulness or inadequate effort. What prevents it is the assumption that it requires something you do not yet have, some level of holiness, some depth of understanding, some accumulated spiritual merit, some act of grace that has not yet been granted. The assumption, in other words, that something must happen before the recognition becomes possible. Goldsmith's insight was this: nothing must happen first. The recognition is available in this moment. It has always been available in this moment. What prevents it is not its own unavailability. What prevents it is the mental activity of believing it to be unavailable. The man who had spent his adult life as an atheist had not come to this story through the front door of religious seeking. He had come through the back door of catastrophe. The catastrophe was a heart attack at 52. Not fatal, as it turned out, though it was close enough to fatal that the distinction felt technical for several months afterward. He survived it and found himself in the strange position of having to rebuild his relationship with his own existence from a very different foundation than the one he had been standing on. Before the heart attack, his relationship with his own existence was primarily practical. He had a life to run, a business, a family, obligations and pleasures, and the ordinary machinery of a functioning adult existence. Questions about the deeper nature of things were not a priority. There was always something more immediately pressing. After the heart attack, the more immediately pressing things had temporarily cleared, and in the space they left, something unexpected arose. Not a conversion experience in the conventional sense, not a sudden belief in God, but a quality of attention to his own being that he had never before been able to sustain, simply because the energy it would have taken to avoid it was no longer available. And in that quality of attention, sitting in a hospital bed with nothing to distract him, he encountered something that he spent the rest of his slow recovery trying to find words for. It was not a feeling. It was not a thought. It was a kind of perception of his own existence that had a quality to it he could only describe as being completely known and completely accepted simultaneously. He was a man who had built his sense of self on performance, on achievement, on being useful and competent and effective. And here he was, unable to perform, unable to achieve, profoundly limited in usefulness and competence, stripped of everything he had thought he was, and what was left when everything was stripped was not diminished. It was, in a way he found almost unbearable to articulate, complete. He did not call it God. He was not comfortable with the word, but he did say to anyone who asked him what the experience had taught him, "I learned that there is something present at the bottom of things that does not require your success in order to remain present. I do not know what to call it, but it was the most intimate thing I have ever experienced." The elderly woman had been married for 53 years. She had been sitting with her husband in the final hours of his dying, holding his hand, in the particular kind of silence that surrounds the passage of a person from one state to another. It was a silence that was completely unlike the silence of absence. It was dense with something, saturated with something. She said afterward that she had expected those hours to be the loneliest of her life. She had braced herself for a solitude that would be absolute, the solitude of losing the person who had been the primary companion of more than half a century. Instead, she found herself held. Not by anyone she could name, not by any presence she could account for in ordinary terms, but held unmistakably in a way that made no logical sense given the circumstances and yet was more real than anything she had experienced in 53 years of loving her husband. She said, "I thought I was going to feel God withdraw when he left. Instead, I felt God arrive in a way I had never felt before. Not because my husband was gone, but because the pain was so complete that there was no space left for pretending. And without the pretending, something that had always been there became impossible to miss. Sacred intimacy is not the reward of the spiritual life. It is the ground of it. It is what everything else is growing in." We have been circling around the center of Psalm 73:28, approaching it from different angles, preparing the ground of understanding for what the verse is actually saying. We are ready now to look directly at two specific word choices in the verse that are almost always passed over too quickly to be heard. The first is the word good. It is good to be near God. This word is doing more work in this verse than it appears to do. In ordinary reading, it sounds like a simple affirmation. Nearness to God is a positive thing. It is good rather than bad. This is true, but it is almost trivially true. And if that were all the word was saying, it would not need to be said. Of course, nearness to God is good rather than bad. That is not a profound observation. But the word good in this context is doing something much more specific. It is the word Asaph reaches for after a crisis, after the nearly catastrophic destabilization of his faith, after the long journey through bitterness and confusion, and the almost slide into complete abandonment of the framework of his life, after the entrance into the sanctuary and the shift of perception that happened there. The word good is not a theological judgment. It is a statement of direct experience. It is the word of a man who has moved from believing something about God to knowing something about God from the inside of it. Think about what the word good sounds like when it is said from within an experience rather than about an experience. When you bite into food that is genuinely, unexpectedly delicious, you do not think, "This food is technically good according to culinary standards." You simply know it. The goodness is self-evident, immediate, not arrived at through argument. This is what the word good is conveying in Psalm 73:28. Not a theological proposition, an immediate recognition. Asaph is not saying, "I believe that nearness to God is good." He is saying, "I am in nearness to God, and the goodness of it is self-evident." The second important feature of the word good in this verse is what Goldsmith would call its tense. It is good. Not, "It will be good when I have attained sufficient holiness." Not, "It was good when I had more faith." Not, "It ought to be good if the theology is correct." It is good, present tense, present reality, not aspiration, not recollection, recognition. This matters enormously because the language of religious seeking is almost always future tense language. It is the language of what you will arrive at, what you will receive, what will be given when the conditions are right. It is language organized around a gap between the present moment and the desired state. It is good, has no gap. It is the language of arrival, of being in something rather than traveling towards something. Goldsmith pointed out that the most significant spiritual recognitions always express themselves in the present tense. Not because the language is chosen deliberately, but because the present tense is the only tense in which reality can actually be encountered. The past is memory. The future is anticipation. The present is the only location where anything is actually happening. And when a consciousness touches the ground of divine presence, it does not experience that ground as something that was present in the past or will be present in the future. It experiences it as what is present now and has always been present and will always be present, because it is not a temporal thing. It is the ground of temporality itself. The woman who had carried her uncertainty about her faith through most of her adult life, was someone whose relationship with religious belief had been one of sincere questioning rather than confident profession. She had not abandoned faith, but she had never been able to claim it in the way she heard others claim it, with certainty, with the sense of settled assurance that seemed to come so naturally to some people. And she had made a kind of peace with this. She lived within the question rather than within the answer. She stayed in the community of faith because she valued the community, the practice, the orientation towards something larger than daily life, even when the larger thing itself remained, for her, somewhat uncertain. And then one afternoon, in no particularly sacred setting, the uncertainty cleared. Not because she received a new argument, not because a doubt was resolved, but because in a moment of particular interior quiet, the question of whether it was real simply became irrelevant. Not because she had decided to stop asking it, but because the reality she had been asking about was present in a way that made asking about it feel like asking whether light is visible while standing in daylight. She said afterward that she understood for the first time what the word "know" means in the context of faith. Not intellectual knowledge, not emotional certainty, something more like the body's certainty about the ground under its feet. Not proof, not argument, just undeniably fact. It is good, not a hope, not a doctrine, a fact recognized in the immediate present. And she understood that Asaph had not written that line as an encouragement to others. He had written it as a record of what had happened in him. The way you write down something extraordinary that happened so that you will not forget it. There is a phrase that comes before "it is good to be near God" in Psalm 73:28 that deserves as much attention as the phrase it introduces. In fact, it is possible that these three words are the most important words in the entire psalm. But as for me, read the verse in its full form and feel the weight of what comes before. But as for me, it is good to be near God. The but is a turning from everything that has been said before in the psalm, from the envy and the bitterness and the questioning and the confusion, a pivot from the outer landscape of Asaph's crisis to the interior landscape of his recognition. The "as for me" is a declaration of a particular kind of personal authority, not the authority of doctrine, not the authority of the tradition, not the authority of the community of faith, the authority of first-person experience, the authority of someone who is not reporting what they have been told, but what they have found to be true in their own direct encounter with reality. This is, in the context of ancient Hebrew religious poetry, a quietly radical move. The community of faith spoke with the authority of collective tradition, the law, the prophets, the accumulated wisdom of the covenant community. The individual's personal experience was not in that framework the primary source of authority. And yet Asaph writes, "As for me," not as the tradition says, not as the law teaches, as for me. This is the grammar of someone who has moved from believing what they have been taught to knowing what they have found. And the gap between those two is not merely a matter of degree. It is a qualitative shift in the nature of the knowing itself. Goldsmith was very clear about what this means for the contemporary seeker. He said that the religious tradition, at its best, functions as a finger pointing at the moon. The tradition is not the moon. The scripture is not the divine. The doctrine is not the reality. They are pointers, maps, systems of notation designed to orient the seeking consciousness toward the territory they describe. And the tragedy of much religious life is that people spend their entire lives studying the map in great and careful detail, becoming extremely sophisticated in their understanding of the map, while never visiting the territory the map is describing. As for me is the moment when the map becomes secondary, not useless, not discarded, but secondary to the direct encounter with what the map was always pointing toward. There is something deeply important about the first-person nature of this recognition. It cannot be delegated. It cannot be transferred. No amount of another person's certainty, however profound and genuine, can substitute for your own recognition. You can benefit from another person's description of the territory. You can be guided by it, oriented by it, given language for what you are looking for. But the finding itself is irreducibly personal. This is why Goldsmith consistently resisted the role of authority in his teaching. He did not want students to believe what he believed. He wanted them to find what he had found. Not his finding, their own, because only their own would be real for them. Only their own would transform their actual experience rather than merely their intellectual framework. The man who had grown up in a family with a strong religious tradition described the moment he understood what "as for me" means. He had been religious his whole life, faithfully, dutifully, sincerely religious. He had inherited the faith of his father and his father's father, and he had carried it with genuine respect and genuine intention. He believed what his tradition taught. He practiced what his tradition recommended. He was, by his own honest assessment, a faithful member of the community. But the faith he was carrying was, he came to recognize in his 40s, not quite his own. It was the faith of his family, the faith of his community, a beautifully made garment that he had been wearing since childhood without ever asking whether it had been tailored for him or for someone else. The moment of recognition did not come through a crisis. It came through a quiet question that arose one evening while he was sitting in the garden after dinner. The question was so simple that it felt almost embarrassing to name it. Do I actually know this is true? Not because my family knows it is true, not because my tradition says it is true. Do I, as this particular human being living this particular life, actually know it? He sat with that question for a long time, and what came, slowly and without drama, was not an answer to the question but something more fundamental, a quality of interior attention that he had never brought to the question before, a willingness to drop the borrowed conviction and encounter the thing itself directly, with no intermediary. And in that willingness, something opened, not a vision, not a revelation in any spectacular sense, just a recognition, quiet and certain and entirely his own, that there was something here, not over there, here, in this moment, in this garden, in this specific awareness that was his own and no one else's. As for me, he understood finally, not as for anyone else, as for me. This recognition cannot be given to you, but it also cannot be kept from you. It is waiting wherever your honest attention is willing to go. Every genuine spiritual insight carries within it a paradox. This is not because reality is inherently self-contradictory, but because our ordinary way of thinking is built for navigating the surface of experience. And when it encounters the depths, it finds that the rules that work on the surface do not apply in the same way below. The contemplative tradition in Christianity and in other spiritual lineages has always known this. The mystics wrote in paradoxes not to be obscure, but because paradox was the only language honest enough to gesture toward what they were trying to point at. Goldsmith's teaching on divine nearness contains 4 paradoxes that are worth sitting with carefully. They are not puzzles to be solved. They are invitations to release a particular kind of thinking and allow a different quality of understanding to arise. The first paradox is this: you cannot get nearer to God than you already are. This sounds, on first encounter, like a statement of comfort designed to reduce the urgency of spiritual seeking. But it is actually something much more challenging than comfort, because if it is true, then every moment you have spent trying to get nearer to God, every prayer directed toward closing the gap, every discipline undertaken for the purpose of earning proximity, has been, at best, well-intentioned, and at worst, a perpetual reinforcement of the very sense of distance you are trying to overcome. To see why this might be true, you have to hold in mind what was said earlier about the nature of divine presence. If the divine is not an object at a particular location, but the ground of consciousness itself, then the relationship between you and the divine is not a spatial relationship. You are not at a certain distance from it. You are in a sense that requires careful understanding within it, or it is within you. The spatial metaphors all become strained at this point, because the reality being described is not spatial. What you can be is more or less aware of this, more or less attentive to it, more or less able to recognize it in the ordinary texture of your experience. But awareness and attentiveness are not the same as nearness. They are the quality of your perception, not the quality of the proximity. The only distance that can be reduced is not the distance between you and God. It is the distance between your ordinary awareness and the ground of your own consciousness, where divine presence is already recognized. The second paradox is this: you cannot feel your way into divine nearness. This is particularly challenging for people in traditions where the felt sense of God's presence is highly valued, and the value is understandable. The warmth of genuine encounter, the comfort of feeling held, the joy of what the tradition calls the love of God poured into the heart. These are real experiences that many people treasure and that have sustained many people through enormous difficulty. But feelings are, by their nature, temporary. They arise and pass. They depend on conditions. They are higher on some days than on others. And if the recognition of divine nearness is indexed entirely to the presence of these feelings, then the recognition will be as intermittent and condition-dependent as the feelings themselves. The recognition that Goldsmith is pointing toward is not deeper feeling. It is more fundamental than feeling. It is the awareness that underlies all experience, including the experience of feeling, the sky that the weather moves through, not the weather itself. This does not mean that feeling has no place. It means that feeling is a form in which divine reality can be expressed, one form among many, rather than the ground of the reality itself. When you stop looking for divine nearness in feeling, you become available to recognize it in the stillness that underlies all feeling. The third paradox: the more earnestly you try to reach God, the more you confirm the experience of distance. This is the most practically disruptive of the 4 paradoxes, because it directly challenges the activity that most sincere religious people are engaged in most of the time. It suggests that the very earnestness of your seeking may be part of what is perpetuating the sense of not finding. Consider the logic. When you reach for something, the reaching presupposes that what you are reaching for is not where you currently are. The reaching is a confirmation of absence. Every prayer directed at bringing God closer is, at an implicit level, a statement that God is currently not close enough, and if the awareness of divine presence is affected by what you implicitly believe about it, then the prayer organized around the assumption of distance may be, moment by moment, reinforcing the very sense of distance it is trying to overcome. This is why Goldsmith repeatedly taught that the deepest form of prayer is not the prayer that asks, but the prayer that recognizes. Not "come to me, God," but "you are here." Not "make yourself present," but "I am present to your presence." The fourth paradox is the one that contains all the others. The moment you stop seeking, you begin to find. This is the most radical statement in the entire contemplative tradition, and it is the most consistently misunderstood. It does not mean that passive indifference is more spiritually productive than active seeking. It does not mean that you should simply live as you have always lived and expect the recognition to arrive without any interior preparation. What it means is that the particular kind of seeking that is organized around a framework of distance and deficit, seeking that is essentially fleeing from the experience of absence, that seeking must stop before the recognition can arise. Not because the stopping is what produces the recognition, but because the stopping removes the most significant obstacle to the recognition. The obstacle is the assumption, perpetually renewed and reinforced by the act of seeking from absence, that the recognition is not yet available. When that assumption drops, even momentarily, even tentatively, the ground that was always there becomes available to be stood on. Everything that has been said so far about divine nearness, about the stillness in which it is recognized, about the paradoxes that protect it from being grasped by ordinary mental activity, must now be tested against the hardest possible circumstances. Because the question that every honest seeker eventually arrives at is not whether the recognition of divine presence is accessible in moments of quiet and stability. The question is whether it survives devastation. When the most feared thing happens, when the loss is absolute, when the grief is so total that the ordinary architecture of the interior life simply collapses, when there is no ground to stand on because everything you have been standing on has gone. Does the ground of divine presence remain? This is not a theoretical question. It is the question that millions of people live through. And it is the question that determines, more than any other, whether the recognition of divine nearness is genuinely fundamental or merely a fair-weather companion. Goldsmith's answer was consistent across all the years of his teaching, and it was not a comfortable answer in the way that comfort is usually meant. It was something more radical. The crisis does not produce the distance from God. The crisis reveals what you have been leaning on instead of God. This requires unpacking, because it can sound on first hearing like a version of the judgmental response. If your faith fails in the crisis, it was not real faith to begin with. That is not what Goldsmith meant. What he meant was more precise. He observed that most people's experience of divine nearness is, without their being aware of it, substantially dependent on the presence of certain supporting conditions: health, financial stability, relational harmony, the ongoing functioning of the ordinary life. When these conditions are present, the experience of God's presence feels real and accessible. When these conditions are taken away, the sense of presence tends to go with them. Not because God's presence is conditional, but because the person's ability to recognize it has been organized around those supporting conditions. The crisis in this understanding is not a withdrawal of divine presence. It is a removal of the scaffolding that was masking where the actual building was. When the supporting conditions are stripped away, the question becomes, is there anything here that does not depend on those conditions? Is there a ground that remains when everything else has been taken? The woman had lost her daughter in an accident. There are no words adequate to what that means, and this account will not try to find them. What it will say is that in the year following her daughter's death, she passed through a complete dissolution of everything she had previously known about her own spiritual life. Prayer became impossible. Not because she refused to pray, but because she had nothing to say. The words she had always used felt fraudulent in the face of what had happened. The God she had always addressed felt, if present at all, present in a way that was completely different from any presence she had previously imagined. She could not attend church. She tried several times and found the liturgical expressions of trust and gratitude unbearable. Not because they were wrong, because she was not yet in a place where she could say them truthfully. And she had, in her grief, become incapable of saying anything untrue. She spent almost a year in what she described as a spiritual wilderness. No prayer, no reading, no community, nothing of the usual structure of her faith life, just grief, and occasionally a quality of silence that she did not choose but found herself in. And in that silence, very gradually, something began to be apparent to her that she had not expected. It was not comfort in any ordinary sense. It was not an answer to the question of why. It was something she described, struggling for language, as a presence that had apparently survived everything, including her ability to reach toward it. She had not been reaching. She had, in fact, been completely unable to reach. And yet the presence she found herself in was not one she had produced by reaching. It was simply there, in the silence, in the middle of the devastation, in a way that made no logical sense given everything she had lost. She said, "I thought I would find God when the grief got better. Instead, I found that God had been in the grief itself, not causing it, not explaining it, just in it. The way light is in a room, even when you cannot see through your tears." The man had lost his business, his marriage, and his sense of who he was within the space of a single year. He was 53 years old and sitting in an apartment that was not his home, with furniture that was not his furniture, surrounded by a life that he could not recognize as the life he had been living. He had not been a religious man in any conventional sense. He had not had much of a framework for what was happening to him in terms that connected to any tradition. He had only the experience itself, which was this. Sitting in that unfamiliar apartment with everything stripped away, he became aware of something he could not have seen when everything was in place. He became aware that there was something present in his own awareness that did not belong to any of the things he had lost. Something that had been there before the business and would be there after the failed marriage and was not touched by any of the loss. Something that was, in the most fundamental sense, simply him, in a way that went deeper than any role he had played or any structure he had built. He would not have called it God. He did not have that language, but later when he encountered Goldsmith's writing, he read a sentence that stopped him completely, and he sat with it for a long time. The sentence said, "When everything has been taken from you, what remains is not nothing. What remains is the ground of your being. And the ground of your being and the ground of divine presence are not two different grounds." He read that sentence and felt something that he had no name for. He felt recognized. What both of these accounts point toward is something that the conventional framework of religious understanding, with its emphasis on earning and deserving and doing enough to merit proximity, is structurally unable to account for. The ground of divine presence is not conditional. It does not depend on your faith being intact. It does not depend on your ability to pray or your participation in religious community or the quality of your moral life. These things may affect your ability to recognize it. They do not affect whether it is there. This is what Goldsmith meant when he said that the divine is the ground of consciousness, not an object that consciousness can approach or fail to approach. The ground of consciousness does not depend on what happens at the surface. It is present whether the surface is calm or stormy, whether the ordinary structures of life are intact or demolished, whether you are praying or unable to pray. The crisis does not move you further from God. The crisis moves away everything that was preventing you from recognizing how near God always was. This is not a teaching designed to make suffering comfortable. It does not explain why the suffering happened or justify it or diminish its reality. What it says, simply and with complete seriousness, is that the suffering is not evidence of divine abandonment, that the silence in which you find yourself when the worst has happened is not the silence of absence, that the ground you are standing on when everything else has fallen away is a ground that has never moved. And for those who have found this to be true in their own devastation, no argument is needed. For those who have not yet faced the testing, this is not information to be stored and retrieved later. It is a seed planted here for when the ground needs to hold. We have covered a great deal of ground. We have moved through the crisis of Asaph's faith, through the misunderstanding that most people carry about what nearness to God means, through the quiet emptiness of sincere seekers who have done everything right and still feel the distance, through the sanctuary where perception shifts, through the contemplative understanding of presence as recognition rather than achievement, through the paradoxes that protect the truth from being grasped by the wrong kind of thinking, through the most severe possible testing of whether divine presence survives devastation. We are now in a position to ask the practical question, not how to achieve divine nearness, because we have seen why that framing is itself the problem, but how to live in a way that is increasingly oriented toward recognition rather than seeking. How to let the daily texture of life become the occasion for returning again and again to the ground that is always already present. Goldsmith called this not a practice, but a returning. The word matters. A practice implies something that builds toward a destination. A returning implies that you are repeatedly coming back to something that is already there, that you have touched before and drifted from, and that you are always free to return to in this moment. 4 movements, not as techniques but as descriptions of what returning looks like in ordinary life. The first movement is the pause before reaction. Life produces constantly and without much consideration for your current state of inner readiness, situations that demand response. The difficult email arrives, the unexpected bill, the sharp word from someone you care about, the health report that is not what you hoped. In every one of these moments, there is a fraction of a second between the stimulus and the response. A brief opening in which the direction of the next moment is still undetermined. Goldsmith taught that this fraction of a second is the most spiritually significant time in the day, not the formal meditation, not the morning prayer. This moment, this specific opening between what has arrived and how you respond to it. In that opening, instead of immediately moving toward the response that anxiety or habit or reactivity would generate, you pause, not for a long time, not necessarily visibly, simply a brief interior pause in which you turn, even momentarily, from the surface of the situation to the ground beneath the situation. This is not a technique for making the situation less real or less important. It is a movement of recognition, a brief touching of the ground that changes the quality of whatever follows. Not because you have extracted advice from the ground, but because the quality of your action, when it comes from that ground rather than from the surface reaction, is simply different, clearer, less driven by the fear that generates the urgency. The second movement is the question that reorients attention. Throughout an ordinary day, the attention moves. This is natural and functional. Attention needs to be in many places, tracking many things. The problem is not the movement of attention. The problem is when all of that movement happens exclusively at the surface, when the whole of waking life is organized around the content of experience, without any reference to the awareness in which the content arises. Goldsmith suggested a question that can be held lightly, not as an interruption to the day's activity, but as a background orientation that gradually changes the quality of attention. The question is simply this: What is here beneath this? Not beneath this problem, beneath this moment, beneath this awareness. What is the ground of this? You do not need to answer the question. You do not need to arrive at a verbal response. The function of the question is simply to redirect attention downward for a moment, away from the content of experience and toward its ground. And the ground, when attended to, even briefly, tends to have a quality that the content does not. A quality of already okayness, of a stability that is not dependent on whether the content is good or bad. This question, held lightly and returned to throughout the day, is not a spiritual exercise separate from ordinary life. It is a gentle but persistent reorientation of attention. And over time, this reorientation changes what the ordinary moments feel like from the inside. The third movement is sitting without producing. This is the most countercultural thing that Goldsmith recommended. In a life that is organized entirely around activity, achievement, and measurable outcomes, the willingness to sit without producing anything is a small act of radical trust. Not for long, even 5 minutes of actual sitting, without checking anything, without planning anything, without performing any kind of mental exercise, without trying to meditate correctly or incorrectly, just being present in the ordinary sense of being in a room and aware of being in a room, has a quality of returning to it that is different from any other activity. What you are returning to is not peace, exactly, though peace may accompany it. You are returning to the simple fact of being present, of being this consciousness in this moment, without a destination to reach or a deficiency to address. And in that returning, the ground tends to become a little more apparent. The fourth movement is reading the verse differently. But as for me, it is good to be near God. Read it not as a verse you are trying to make true by sufficient devotion. Read it as a description, as Asaph wrote it. Not as aspiration, but as recognition. As something that is already the case, whether your feelings confirm it at this moment or not. The man who had begun sitting in silence every morning had not come to the practice with any particular expectation. He had read about Goldsmith's teaching, been interested by it, and decided to try the simplest possible version of what was being suggested. He would sit for 5 minutes each morning before doing anything else. No formal meditation technique, no visualization, no prayer in any directed sense. Just sitting. After a week, he reported nothing had happened. After 2 weeks, the same. After a month, he noticed something small. He was less reactive than he had been. Not dramatically, not in a way he could point to directly, but the edge that had characterized his mornings, the sense of urgency and low-level anxiety that he had assumed was simply part of his temperament, had softened slightly. After 3 months, he described something more specific. He had begun to notice, in the course of ordinary activity, a background quality to his experience that he had not noticed before. Not a feeling exactly, more like a texture, a kind of okayness that seemed to underlie whatever was happening at the surface, regardless of whether the surface was pleasant or unpleasant. He said, "I did not go looking for God. I just stopped being so busy running away from stillness." And something that had apparently been there all along became available to be noticed. After 6 months, he was asked whether he felt closer to God than he had before. He was quiet for a while, and then he said something that Goldsmith would have recognized immediately. "I don't feel closer. I feel like the distance was never the right word." There is a difference between knowing what a sentence means and having the sentence become true in your experience. This difference is not a matter of degree. It is a qualitative shift. It is the difference between reading about the flavor of an unfamiliar fruit and actually tasting it. The words may be the same before and after. What is different is the entire context in which the words are heard. Psalm 73:28 is a sentence that almost every person who has spent any time in Christian or Jewish tradition has encountered. But as for me, It is good to be near God. It is in hymnals. It is in devotional books. It is quoted in sermons, used in pastoral care, inscribed on greeting cards. It is extremely well known, and it is almost universally misread, not because the readers are careless or unintelligent, because the sentence is, without the interior context that makes it alive, almost impossible to hear correctly. Without having been through something like what Asaph went through, the sentence sounds like a mild endorsement of religious practice. Yes, being near God is good. Of course it is. Now let us get on with the service, but with the context, with the full arc of Psalm 73 behind it, with the crisis and the bitterness and the almost slipping and the entrance into the sanctuary and the shift in perception that happened there, with the particular flavor of first-hand recognition in the words "as for me" and the present tense directness of "it is good." With all of that, the sentence becomes something entirely different. It becomes the report of an explorer who has returned from a territory that most people only have maps of. It becomes the testimony of a consciousness that has moved from believing something about God to knowing something from within the direct experience of it. The woman who had been uncertain about her faith for most of her adult life, the woman we met earlier who lived inside the question rather than the answer, encountered Psalm 73:28 one morning after several years of quiet, contemplative practice. She had read it many times before. She had read it this morning in the same translation she had always used. But this morning, something was different about the reading. It was not a dramatic experience. She did not feel a sudden surge of emotion. She did not have a vision. She did not hear anything. She simply read the words, and for the first time, they were not a description of something she was hoping to arrive at. They were a description of what was currently true. But as for me, it is good to be near God. She said later that the difference was almost too subtle to describe. That the words looked the same, sounded the same, had the same intellectual content, but the relationship between the words and her experience was completely different. Before, the words described a destination. Now they described a location. She was in the thing the sentence was pointing at, not because something extraordinary had happened that morning, not because she had finally accumulated enough spiritual merit to deserve the recognition, but because years of returning, of sitting without producing, of holding the question lightly, of learning to rest in awareness rather than perpetually reaching from it, had gradually, incrementally, barely noticeably shifted the quality of her ordinary attention. And in that shifted quality of attention, the ordinary morning had a character to it that it had always been able to have and that she had simply not been attending to. The character of being accompanied, the character of not being alone in the most fundamental possible sense, the character that Asaph, in 3 words, called being near God. She did not need to believe it anymore. She had not left belief behind. But belief had become, for the first time, unnecessary as a substitute for recognition. The recognition was present. The belief simply confirmed what was already known from the inside. This is what Goldsmith spent his life pointing toward, not a belief system, not a set of practices, not a theological position, a quality of recognition that is available to any consciousness that becomes still enough to encounter what is always already present. Psalm 73:28 is not a promise, it is a description. And the description is accurate. We have come a long way from where we began. From the man on the edge of losing his faith to the millions of people who read a verse and cannot find the experience it describes, to the contemplative depth of what it actually means for nearness to God to be not a destination but a recognition, to the radical stability of that recognition when everything else falls away. And we end not with a conclusion but with an opening, not with a list of things to do, because this entire exploration has been an argument, gentle but persistent, that the things to do framework is not what is needed here. Not with a theological summary, because the thing being pointed at is not theological. With an invitation. The invitation is simply this. Somewhere beneath the thinking that is happening as you read these words, there is something that is not thinking. Something that is aware of the thinking, something that has been aware of every thought and feeling and experience you have had since you first began to be aware of anything. Something that has not changed in the same way that your thoughts and feelings have changed. Something constant. You do not have to name it. You do not have to believe a particular thing about it. You do not have to organize your life differently, change your religious affiliation, adopt a new practice, or perform any spiritual exercise. You only need to be willing for a moment to be still enough to notice it, not to produce it, not to reach toward it, simply to be present to what is already here. This is what Asaph found in the sanctuary. This is what Goldsmith taught across decades of contemplative engagement. This is what the verse has always been saying to everyone who was still enough to hear it. But as for me, it is good to be near God. Not because Asaph achieved something, because he stopped long enough to recognize what had never been absent. The same stillness is available to you now, not later, not when your circumstances improve, or your faith feels more stable, or your doubts resolve, or your practice deepens. Now, in this moment, in this awareness that is reading these words, the nearness that Psalm 73:28 describes is not something you have yet to find. It is something you have yet to stop looking past. If something in these words stirred a quiet recognition within you, not an emotion, but a knowing, subscribe to Joel Goldsmith Wisdom for more teachings like this. And in the comments, share this, not what you learned today, but what you remembered.